good to welcome you to class. My name is Dr. Yoitum, and this is LIT 104, Introduction to Poetry. We are two lecturers in the course, Mahambo Sal and Dr. Micah Supo. The course outline is ready and will be handed out soon. And each lecturer will be specified his topic. For today, I'm going to take the introductory class. I want to introduce the class to you. We are live right now on YouTube, and of course, after the class, you can always access the class on YouTube. And every other resource material that you need is available on my website, ayoitim.com. So, we'll begin with the definition of poetry. Poetry is one of the oldest subjects known to man. Poetry is one of the oldest subjects known to man. Of the three genres of literature that we have, poetry is the oldest. This is because poetry began with the human expression. Poetry began with the need for human expression. It was born with human language. But poetry is no ordinary human language. Poetry is at the apex of the human expressive ability. Remember, you need to pay attention. You cannot possibly write everything down. So you need to take down notes, and you can't write everything down. As I said, you need to pay attention. All the resources required for the class are on my website, and the class will be on YouTube. Okay? So the most important thing is for you to listen and take down notes. You won't be able to write down every word. It is not realistic. So that is what you need to know. So as I said, poetry is at the apex of the human expressive ability. When we are talking about speech, human speech, in terms of gradation, poetry is the highest. In terms of gradation, poetry is the highest. That is, if you want to grade human speech, you have to place poetry at the apex. It is the best of the human word power. And so everyone who desires to be an orator or a leader, everyone in the field of speech making should study poetry. Conventionally, poetry is defined as a genre of literature organized in lines and stanzas. That is the formalist definition of poetry. That is the formalist definition of poetry. Poetry is a genre of literature that is organized in lines and stanzas. When you define poetry that way, you are engaging the form of poetry. You are engaging the structure of poetry. Because that immediately separates it from the other genres of literature. Because, for instance, drama is organized in acts and scenes, and prose is organized in chapters and paragraphs. But poetry is organized in lines and stanzas. So formally, poetry has its distinct nature. And that is what sets it apart from the other genres of literature. So if you want to begin a definition or start a definition of poetry, you need to mention that. But poetry is also other things. For instance, poetry is the shortest of the three genres of literature. Poetry is the shortest of the three genres of literature. Except for the epic. Of course, we do not write epic anymore. It is not conventional to write epic anymore. It's not typical of our era to have epic writing, epic poetry. Especially in these days of short attention span. Nobody will read it. So apart from the epic, poetry is the shortest of the three genres of literature. That means that the poet has a limited space to operate. The poet has a limited space to operate. The poet has a limited space to practice his art. So poetry by its very nature tends to be terse. Tends to be terse. T-E-R-S-E, terse. Poetry by its very nature tends to be terse and compact. This is because the poet has to find a way to say everything that he has to say within the space that the medium allows. The poet has to try everything possible to say everything that he needs to say within the space that the medium allows. This is why the poet will not write in ordinary language or everyday language. The poet will not write in ordinary language or everyday language. In other words, he will not be prosaic. Will not be what? Prosaic. Prosaic is spelled P-R-O-S-A-I-C. I will not be, his work will not be characterized by ordinary language, typical or prose. So the poet will have to communicate using images or imagery and symbols, signs, and other indirect ways of communication. Which is why poetry is usually subject to interpretation. The reason poetry is always subject to interpretation because it has layers of meaning. A poem is not likely to mean one thing because the poet does not write in a straightforward language, does not communicate in everyday ordinary language. In fact, the language of poetry is typical of the language of literature because it is usually foregrounded. Language of poetry is usually what? Foregrounded. Foregrounded is spelled Foregrounded. ED, foregrounded. The language of poetry is foregrounded in the sense that it is written to pleasantly surprise the reader because everyday occurrences are rendered in extraordinary ways. Everyday situation, ordinary things are said in extraordinary ways. So in poetry, it is the language that matters. It's the language, it's the style that define poetry. So indirectness in communication is one of the characteristics of poetry. The poet will not give you everything on a gold platter. You have to work hard to know what the poet is trying to say. You will need to work hard in order to know what the poet means in the poem. So poetry is subject to interpretation. Poetry is imbued with aesthetics in the use of language. In fact, to appreciate poetry is to appreciate the beauty of the poet's use of words, the poet's command of language, the poet's mastery of language. Poetry is known for the expression of aesthetics. And when we talk about aesthetics, we are talking about beauty, but specifically beauty in the use of language. Beauty in the use of language. And as I've said, to appreciate poetry is to appreciate how the poet has commanded language. So that takes us to the idea that the basic raw material that the poet has in manufacturing poetry is the word. The what? The word. W-O-R-D. Okay? And remember that in the beginning was the word. And the word was with, and the word was God. That's what you need to understand. Because at that level, you will understand that the poet has this creative power that comes from the primary creative force that began the universe. And so whenever you see a poet, you need to bow in greetings. Because poets are the closest to God. Poets are the closest people to God. Because they use the same materials that God used in creating the universe to recreate the universe continuously in their own ways. Because you need to understand that words have performative effects. Words have what? Performative effect. Meaning, as you speak, it is happening. So when you understand this, in the realm of poetry, we do not just say whatever comes to our mind. We choose our words. Poets choose their words. Because words do have consequences. And words have performative power to bring about what it says in the universe. So that's how powerful poets are. They are co-creators with God. Poets are gods in their own rights because they use the divine raw material that God used in creating the universe to recreate the universe continuously in their own domain. So the basic raw material for poetry is the word. And so if you want to be a great poet, I would like you to know your words very well, know the language very well. You cannot be a good poet without commanding the language, which is the medium of expression. It doesn't have to be English. It doesn't have to be English. It can be Bibio, it can be Anna, it can be Efek. But you need to command the language very well because that's what makes you, that's the only raw material that you have. Another characteristic of poetry, another characteristic that defines poetry is economy of words. Is what? Economy of words. And that is linked to the fact that the poet does not have a lot of space to operate with. Okay? The poet does not have a lot of space to operate with. So he has to do economy with words. That means in poetry we use the minimum words available to express ourselves. We have to use the minimum words available to express ourselves. Now, because the poet has to use the minimum words available to him, given the medium, the space that the medium allows him, poets tend to use compact words that require investigation before one could understand. So remember then that poetry is written in imagery, poetry is written using imagery and symbols and metaphoric expressions, figurative expressions, language that requires interpretation in order to be understood. So poetry does not only express the beauty in language, poetry also expresses the beauty in the world. Poetry also expresses the beauty around us by recreating them. For instance, God created the universe, the earth, the trees, the flowers, the sun, the moon. Okay? And it's beautiful. Now the poet comes along and recreates that creation in poetry. So you have poetry about rain, poetry about the sun, poetry about flowers, to bring to you in words the beauty of God's creation. That's how powerful poetry is. So in language and otherwise, poetry aims at the depiction of beauty. Poetry has rhythm. Poetry has rhythm. Traditionally, conventionally, poetry has to have rhythm. And the rhythm of poetry is taken from the rhythm of nature, because nature has its own rhythm. Poetry follows after nature. Poetry follows after nature. So it aims to depict the rhythm in nature, in the universe. The fact that things occur orderly in that season at the proper time. For instance, you have the rhythm of night and day, the rhythm of the tides. Sometimes it's high tide and sometimes low tide. At the present time, night will come, and at the present time, the day will come. Continuously. That's the rhythm of nature. Even in human life, we have the rhythm of birth, growth, death, rebirth, and so on and so forth. So poetry follows this rhythm because this rhythm creates order, which is found in poetry. Poetry is a created art. It is not something that happens by chance. Good poetry cannot happen by chance. It has to be masterminded by a creative mind. Someone has to bring it about. Just as we have the, the theory that the universe so rhythmic, so orderly, could not have happened by chance. There has to be someone behind such an orderly, rhythmic creation as the earth, as the universe. And so we call him the intelligent designer. Anything of beauty, anything that has order and rhythm could not possibly have happened by chance. And that is why those who believe in the existence of God will say that if the universe is so rhythmic and orderly, then it could not have happened by chance. There's an intelligent designer, and they call the intelligent designer God. Same with poetry. Good poetry is brought about by the intelligence, by the thinking of the poet, which happens through, first of all, diction, the choice of words. Carefully choosing words and putting them in the right order in sentences, with the right punctuation mark, the right stanzas is what creates poetry. So poetry follows from the order and beauty in nature. So where there is orderliness and beauty, poetry is there. What did I say? Where there is orderliness and beauty, poetry is there. Poetry is found wherever there is beauty and order. Okay? Beautiful work of art are poetic in nature because they are beautifully created. Okay? And which is why most of you are nothing than poetry. You are poetry. If I say I'm poetry, You know why you love poetry? Because you are wonderfully made, beautifully made. Although we do have some people who are fearfully made, they are beautiful in their own way. Because there's no one who is not beautiful. So, where there is beauty and order, there is poetry. That's why you are poetry. Okay? Wherever things are kept in order, for instance, the desk in this classroom are arranged orderly. So you could see that they did not happen by chance. Not just wake up and see them like that. Somebody came, did a measurement, planned how each desk will be in length, in size, against the room. So don't think that somebody just sat somewhere and made this desk and then now brought them to put them here. No. We will have come here first to measure and know how many desks will be here and in what row, how many rows. So that shows you what goes into the writing of poetry. It's a lot of preparation and planning. So if you're going to be a poet, you have to be ready because nothing good comes easy. If you're going to write that one poem that is so good, you have to sit down and do the work. Planning ahead, intelligent planning, selecting the words, crafting the sentences, so on and so forth. So at the end of it, you have the meaning that you want to send across. Because all that you have as a poet is the word. And you use that word to achieve many other things, like making someone cry, making someone laugh, making someone happy, making someone sad, will be through the instrumentality of the word, which is perhaps the only raw material available to the poet. So because poetry has rhythm and orderliness, poetry is sung like in nature. Poetry is sung like in nature. Poetry is sung like. Poems are songs. Poems are songs. That's what you need to know. Poems are songs. And poems are songs because the poet writes to depict rhythm, melody. Traditional, conventional poetry from its very beginning was orderly and well measured. Based on the existing conventions. You didn't just write as you liked. There were conventions to guide your writing each type of poetry. It's only now that we can write poems the way we like, freely, because we are using free verse. Before now, poetry was a discipline, of course, it is a discipline endeavor. We can have a poem that says you must write 8 words per line. We can have a poem that says you must write 10 syllables per line. And you must have a certain rhyme scheme. Otherwise, you're not writing that type of poetry. That means that for you to write that poem, you have to sit down and select the words when you're writing each line, you have to select the syllables and words so that there will just be the number required. So the existence of rhythm or meter in poetry is what makes poetry melodious and song-like. You need to understand that most of the hymns that you sing in the church were first written as poems. But because they had rhythm, regular rhythm, they were later set to music or to tune. In fact, any set of words that has regular rhythm can be set to music. If you see an excerpt that has regularity in rhythm, maybe the first line is 8 syllables, the second line 8 syllables, so that it can be musical. Because it already has a musical quality because of the regular rhythm. So that is why we can claim that poems are songs. Of course, when you consider all literature, you will understand the musical origins of poetry. Because in all literature, songs are poems. Songs are aspects of poetry, including chants and tongue twisters. So the musicality found in poetry adds to the beauty of poetry. The musicality found in poetry adds to the beauty of poetry. So there are many other definitions of poetry. By poets, critics of poetry. Poetry might need to be defined based on certain conventions, theories, and traditions. Poetry might need to be defined based on certain conventions, theories, and traditions. For instance, Archibald MacLeish, Archibald, Archibald, Archibald MacLeish, MC, capital Leish, MacLeish, said that a poem should not mean but be. A poem should not mean but be. A poem should not mean but be. poem should not mean but be. A poem should not mean but be. This definition by McLeish emphasizes the formal quality of poetry. The formal quality of poetry. Emphasizes the formal quality of poetry. The formal quality of poetry. The formal quality of poetry is that it emphasizes the form over content. We'll talk about that as we go along. For now, know that this definition by McLeish infers the formal quality of poetry, which emphasizes the form, the structure, that means the language, how the poem appears over what it actually says. So the definition emphasizes the formal existence of poetry over what it means, over meaning. A poem must not mean but be. That means the poem has to exist formally before we consider the meaning. The Romantic writers, in Romanticism, poetry is defined as the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions collected in tranquility. In Romanticism, poetry is defined as a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. A spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. This is a definition that sees poetry as expressive. In this definition, poetry is seen as what? Expressive. A work of art is said to be expressive when it is based on how its author feels. When it is based on the feelings, and it is directed by and at the feelings of its author. Work of art is said to be expressive when it emphasizes the feelings, emotions of its writer. So this definition sees poetry as an inspired art. This definition sees poetry as what? As an inspired art. Inspired art. Poetry is inspired. Poetry is inspired in the Romantic tradition. That means that a larger than life force usually seizes the poet. A larger than life force immediately does what? Seizes the poet. And makes him restless, torments him or her until the poem is written down. That's why sometimes when you write a work of art, you write a book, some people come and ask you, what was your inspiration? What inspired you to write this work? In the Romantic tradition, the inspiration comes from the personal experiences of the writer. So the writer is inspired to write because he or she saw something. That's why they normally say, when you see something, say something. You see something, say something. And what the poet saw holds him, torments him. The picture remains with him until he is able to do what? Recreate it in poetry. A spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. That is poetry. So poetry is an inspired art. Another, and this particular word was, definition was made by William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth. Wordsworth. William Wordsworth. Then another romantic writer, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Another romantic writer, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, defines poetry as the best words in the best order. The best words in the best order. The best words in the best order. Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Samuel Taylor Coleridge defines poetry as the best words in the best order. Neil Shindare defines poetry as man meaning to man. Neil Shindare defines poetry as man meaning to man. It says poetry is man meaning to man. Okay? Neil Shindare, Neil Shindare, one of the major poets writing in Africa today, defines poetry as what? Man meaning to man. Poetry is man meaning to man. And this definition is contained in a poem that I'm going to read right now to you. The definition is contained in the poem that I'm about to read to you. poem goes, poetry is not the esoteric whisper of an excluding tongue, not a clap trap for a wandering audience, not a learned quiz entombed in Greco-Roman law. Poetry is a live spring which gathers timber. From more threads it plucks a binger of action. The more mind it stays. Poetry is the hawker's ditty, the eloquence of the sun, the lyric of the marketplace, the luminous ray on the grass morning dew. Poetry is what the soft wind musics to the dancing leaf, what the soul tells the dusty path, what the bee hums to the alluring nectar, what rainfall croons to the luring eaves. Poetry is no oracle's kennel or a sole philosopher's stone. Poetry is man meaning to man. That's what Neil Shindler says. What Neil Shindler implies there is that poetry has to be accessible semantically. What Neil Shindler implies there is that poetry has to be semantically accessible to everyone in society, especially to the common people. Therefore, the poet has to tone down his language. Neil Shindler advocates simplicity in the language of poetry, the use of simple words in the writing of poetry. Neil Shindler says we should use simple language to write our poems. Of course, not all poets believe that we should use simple language in writing poetry, and that's why most students don't like poetry, because they see poetry as being what? Difficult. Whereas it is not. It's just that the poet wants to challenge your mental ability, the ability to think. Of course, indeed, those who deal with poetry are usually among the most intelligent people. Because poetry allows you to exercise your mind, makes you think. And those who think are actually intelligent. So you need to understand. So, but then we have a group of poets that are called obscurantists. We have a group of poets that are called obscurantists. They write to hide meaning. These poets write to hide meaning because they deliberately use obscure diction, imagery, and symbols. They deliberately use obscure diction, imagery, and symbols in the writing of the poetry. So they call them obscurantists. They write to obscure. They write to hide meaning. So if you read Wole Soyinka, poetry, you are likely to encounter this phenomenon. If you read J.P. Clark's poetry, you are likely to encounter this phenomenon. If you read Christopher Kibo's poetry, you're likely to encounter this phenomenon of obscurantism. So when you write like this, only the elite will understand. When you write like this, only the elite will understand. So Wole Soyinka, JP Clark Bekederomo, some people just call him JP Clark. His full name is JP Clark Bekederomo. And Christopher Kibo belong to the obscurantism mode of writing poetry. And Neil Shindare is taking a different stance because the kind of poetry he writes is for the masses and not everyone usually educated. The educated people, the highly educated people who understand the poetry written by the obscurantists are few. They might just be 2% of the population. But if you are writing a kind of poetry that the masses should really understand, then you have to make it simple for the averagely educated people to understand. It's not everyone who goes to school to have high degrees, PhD, and all of that, to understand deep words, big language, and that are written in poetry. When you have people who have finished secondary school, market women, and all of that, and you want them to understand your poetry, then you need to bring down your language. That's what Neil Shindare is saying. Poetry is man, meaning to man. And why do you write this kind of poetry? Why do you write this kind of poetry? You write this kind of poetry because you want to educate the masses. You want to inform the masses. You want to change the mindset of the masses. About issues in society that concern them. And you want them to take action. So this kind of poetry is called socially committed poetry. You can write it down. Socially committed poetry. Or poetry of social commitment. Poetry of social commitment. Poetry of what? Social commitment. Poetry of social commitment is a type of poetry that is interested in changing the conditions of people in society. Poetry of social commitment is a type of poetry that is interested in altering social situations, societal conditions. So note that to write this kind of poetry, you need to reach the masses. And to reach the masses, your poems have to be accessible. You can even write in pidgin. So that the ordinary people will understand. Maybe the people are going through hunger, starvation, health crisis, and you want to send a message that will empower them through poetry, then you need to tone down your language. That is what Goshenka is saying. So I have also defined poetry. In my first poetry collection, entitled Songs of Our Time, it is stated that poetry is time recorded in quotes. 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 You need also to note down this expression about the process of writing poetry, or what makes poetry possible, the type of poetry that needs to be written, or who the poet should be in order to write the type of poetry that will inspire society or will be effective. And that has to do with the mind of the poet. And so I said the mind of the poet must be mad. The mind of the poet must be mad. The mind of the poet must be mad. As in meadow. The mind of the poet must be mad. So the mind of the poet must be mad. The madness of the poet must be mathematical. The math itself must be simple. The math itself must be simple. the math itself. Math. The manners of a poet must be mathematical. The math itself must be simple. Since the quadratic of words destroys enthusiasm. Since the quadratic of words destroys enthusiasm. So you have the mind of the poet must be mad, the manners of the poet must be mathematical, the math itself must be simple, since the quadratic of words destroys enthusiasm. So what we're saying there is that the mind of the poet should be radically different from the mind of any ordinary person. Remember that the poet is not an ordinary person. That's why I say whenever you see the poet, you should do what? You should bow. You should greet the poet with a bow. Right? Because they are close to God. Okay? They are embodied with the creative force, the primary creative force of the universe. And after that, so that madness is poetic, not the literal madness. It's just that the mind of the person is radically different. The person does not think like every other person. Because they have a creative, radically creative mind. And then the madness of the poet must be mathematical. That means this is a kind of calculated madness. Okay? Meaning it is no madness at all. It is order in chaos. It's what I refer to as order in chaos. Order in chaos. It's calculated. It's the kind of madness that's associated with Hamlet. When one of the characters says there's a method to his madness, there's a method to his madness. That means whatever he does that looks mad is not necessarily mad because it's well planned and calculated. Because the poet does not just write, the poet thinks before writing. It's just that he writes in a different way compared to other people. The math itself must be simple. So here I'm also subscribing to the need to use simple language, simple but creative language in the writing of poetry. I'm also subscribing to the need to use simple but creative language in the writing of contemporary poetry. Because contemporary poetry is directed at first the masses and then the Gen Zs who have short attention span. Okay? And will not want to listen to anything that they don't understand. So, poetry has to be simple in language. Because when the words are too difficult, people will not want to read the poem. People will not be excited about reading poetry. Since the quadratic equation is usually a type of math that students fear. That's why I use that language there. So you should try your own definition of poetry. What does poetry mean to you? What does poetry mean to you? We'd like to hear that. What does poetry mean to you? So what do you think about what poetry means to you and what you need to write about that? Because each person will have to write his own definition of poetry. We'll move on and talk about the origins of poetry. Talk about the origins of poetry. As I said earlier, poetry is linked to the need for man to express himself. Poetry is linked to the need for man to express himself. So with the birth of human speech came poetry. With the birth of human speech came poetry. Man constantly finds the best ways to express his experiences. And this is why poetry was born. To the need to say ordinary things in extraordinary ways brought about poetry. The need to say ordinary things in extraordinary ways brought about poetry. The need to speak and impress. The need to speak and create an impression, a lasting impression. The need to speak in an aesthetically pleasing manner. The need to speak in an aesthetically pleasing manner. Brought about poetry. The origin of poetry is found in the music that is present in nature. The origin of poetry is found in the music present in nature. When you listen to the sounds that birds make, how the cock crows in the morning, the voices of children as they walk to school, babies crying or cooing, all these elicit poetic responses from us. The voices of school children, the sound of waves breaking on the shore, the sound made when farmers are clearing the bush. All this elicits poetic responses from us. The origin of poetry lies in the beauty in nature. Poetry aims to represent the beauty in nature. This is where poetry comes from. Poetry mimics the rhythm in nature. Poetry comes from nature. Poetry comes from our oral tradition. The modern poetry originates from our oral tradition. By modern poetry, we are talking about written poetry. Whenever we're talking about modern literature, modern drama, modern poetry or prose, we're talking about written literature, which is different from oral literature. But the origin of modern literature is oral literature. And so, poetry as we know it today has its roots in our oral tradition. Poetry has its roots in our oral tradition. Particularly our songs and our chants. Our songs and our chants. Of course, we have many types of songs. Mostly folk songs. Particularly, we have work songs. Work songs. Work songs. Work songs are songs sung while people are working. They have their rhythm depending on the type of work being done. Fishermen could have work songs while paddling the boats. Farmers do have their work songs while clearing the bush. Even women do have their work songs maybe while washing clothes by the bank of the river or while washing clothes in the stream, and so on and so forth. Can you think of any work song in your environment, in your culture? Can you think of any work song in your culture? So think about that. If you have any work song in your culture, you should think about that. And when you write it down, you sing it, I want you to note the poetic qualities in the song. To pay attention to the poetic qualities in the song. Let's talk about the functions of poetry. Let's talk about the functions of poetry. What function does poetry serve in human society? Now, the function of poetry follows from the functions of literature. Functions of poetry follows from the functions of literature. So, the general functions of literature are associated with the functions of poetry. Right? Because we are talking about that is that poetry educates, poetry entertains, poetry informs. Of course, the primary function of poetry should be entertainment. Should be what? Entertainment. But it has to entertain. The primary function of poetry is that of entertainment. Poetry entertains. That's what literature does. If you are asked the primary function of literature, and even when you want to write literature yourself, the basic thing you need to know is that you have to entertain your audience, first of all. Because you see, those words that the poet uses are entertaining because they're not everyday language. They're meant to entertain. And that's why you used to love your nursery rhyme. Twinkle, twinkle, little star. It is not ordinary language because the words are carefully selected and the rhythm is different from everyday speech. And that is why it is foregrounded for your entertainment. That's why poetry should be recited. Poetry is meant to be recited. Poetry is meant to be recited. Drama is meant to be staged. Poetry is meant to be recited. Because it is when you recite it that you bring out its full potential. That you can enjoy it best. Because you need the sound, the melody, the rhythm, and for you to enjoy poetry. So when you just read it, mum, you won't enjoy it until you say it, recite it. That's where the beauty lies. And that recitation is entertaining. And it comes out best nowadays with spoken word poetry. Have you come across spoken word artists in recent times? It's quite entertaining, right? It's quite entertaining. The way they do it, the performance, the rhythm, everything. So that is the entertaining aspect of poetry. And then poetry can educate. If I say educate, educate. But you can educate. Educate. All right? But you can teach you something. You can learn something from poetry. That's why you need to read poetry. One thing that poetry can teach you is language. Poetry can teach you human language at the highest level. The reason we encourage students to read a lot of literary work is because they can improve their language by so doing. You will not know when your entire language map would have been altered by the time you read to a certain point. And so you do yourself a disservice when you refuse to read. You do yourself more harm than good when they say read and you refuse. Because poetry alters your cognitive abilities, makes it higher, make it stronger, makes it tougher, sharper. So even if you will not have loved to read poetry before now, knowing these functions, knowing what poetry is capable of doing, can transform you, you should begin to read poetry. In fact, if there's any time you don't see poetry, look for poetry to read. Because poetry can change your entire language mapping. And that's why those who read poetry and other works of literature are set up to be very creative and intelligent in the long run. So if I say, I will read poetry. Okay? So make it a lifetime commitment. Right? Make it a lifetime commitment to read poetry. But you can even say, I and my family will read poetry. Right. So poetry can inform. Poetry can inform. Poetry can inform. Depending on the type of poetry you read, you can have information about other cultures, the politics of other countries, the political situations in other places. You might not have been to London, but through poetry, you can know what's going on there, how the people live, how they speak, their culture, and so on and so forth. So poetry can teach you about other people's culture, can inform you, give you information, but it can empower you. Even if you want to be a writer of poetry, the first thing that you need to do is to read poetry. Make it a habit of reading poetry. There's a whole lot of things that you can learn from it. Can benefit just by reading poetry. You might not have been to America, but by reading American poetry, you might be able to grapple with the issues in America, what the blacks are undergoing there, the situation of black people in America, their history, the history of slavery, and so on and so forth. You could learn how they are oppressed by whites there, and how that oppression continues in different forms in today's American South. So literature exposes you to other people's culture, traditions, politics, and so on and so forth. That's why reading is a veritable instrument for personal education and personal empowerment. Poetry can make us more human and humane. 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 It means that poetry can humanize us. Poetry can humanize us. Poetry can humanize us. You know, we live at a time when people have mostly lost their humanity. People have become monstrous. All right? People have become monstrous. In the sense that they can kill other human beings without caring. But poetry, if you read poetry, you'll be more humane. You think about the other person. You'll be more empathetic. You'll not be a bad guy. All right? Poetry makes you less of a bad guy. Poetry makes you more of a good guy. Poetry makes you less rugged. It's a good person. A human being you're supposed to be. So poetry humanizes. Poetry has the power to make you empathetic. I mean, you think of other people's circumstances, not only yours. You're not selfish. Though self-preservation is a mark, is a nature of man. But poetry makes you more empathetic towards others. Makes you think, no, that others also have feelings as well. Makes you more human. Poetry is therapeutic. Poetry is therapeutic. Poetry is therapeutic. This means that poetry has a healing power. Poetry has what? Healing power. Poetry can heal psychological or mental wounds. Poetry can heal emotional wounds. Poetry is like therapy. That's what I mean by therapeutic. Being therapeutic, it can heal the individual. A country like Rwanda that had genocide healed through poetry. Given the kind of poetry that is written, poetry can give you relief from pain. Poetry can give you relief from pain. Because poetry is cathartic. You can recite it, a certain poem, and it releases you, frees you from all burdens, all psychological burdens. Poetry is that powerful. So we now use poetry to heal people. Because words are also medicinal. But the words are also medicinal. Words are also medicinal. Because words were used to create the world. So it has the power to transform, depending on how you choose. All right, so you can go to the hospital, and just by the way the nurses talk to you, you become healed. All right? Probably in the home, people were just shouting at you, punching you, and all that. That made you sick. Now you went to the hospital, the nurse is caring, gentle, and you suddenly become well. And when they wanted to go home, you say, I want to remain in the hospital. Hospital is a better place. Okay? Although these days, the nurses have become so rude that their words can kill you and not the illness. Okay? Maybe they should be made to understand the healing power of words on the patient. So there should be a project sometimes where we go to the hospital and read healing poems to the sick. Because that's how Eastern countries, that's what Eastern countries combine in their medicine. Western medicine is just injection, all right, and bitter drugs. But Eastern countries will combine the relevant soothing words with other things to heal. Because words are powerful. You can change someone's gene in a way. That's what poetry does. Okay, so with that, we are going to bring our class to a close. I hope that when we come back, we'll take another topic. So have a pleasure.